On behalf of the young professionals track this year at the MAS-ICNA Convention, I'd like to welcome you all to our session. I'm very excited to kind of get things started with you all, and I pray that the next few days are filled with learning and knowledge and blessings for all of us. A few announcements before we kind of get started. The first being that you should kind of use the updated MAS-ICNA app to kind of navigate throughout the convention. There is speaker information as well as information about the sessions and their locations that are included on the app that will be helpful for you to use. So I do recommend downloading the app kind of early on so that you can use it to your benefit. Additionally, we will be hosting question and answer sessions for all of the sessions in this lecture hall. In order to submit a question, you'll want to make sure that you have the MAS-ICNA app to do that. So go ahead and download the app if you haven't done so already. You can find our session, which we'll kind of discuss in a minute, and then you'll be able to submit your questions anonymously for our Q&A session. All right, so we'll kind of go ahead and get things started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Our first session for our track today is titled Happily Ever After. The divorce rate has skyrocketed among Muslim couples in recent years, likely due to misconstrued expectations about marriage. While Western society paints a fairy tale image about what marriage can be, this is often not challenged with hardships and difficulties that can arise during marriage. The aim of today's talk is to present us with a more realistic expectation of what marriage is and to offer us some advice for our singles, our engaged couples, and our married couples on how to have a successful relationship. Speaking on this topic, we have Sister Suzy Ismail, who is the founder and head communication counselor at Cornerstone, which is a faith-based communication counseling center with several local and international offices that really focus on identity building and improving relationships for youth, couples, and families. She has authored several books, including Modern Muslim Marriage and When Muslim Marriage Fails, and has been invited to speak locally and globally on topics such as these. She currently serves as an executive officer and director for nonprofit boards and resides with her family. So without further ado, please help me welcome Suzy Ismail to the stage.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So I love the 10:30 slot on the first day of a conference because I feel like they always give us a really big room and we can have more discussion style where the group who is here are the early risers, the ones who got their registration done early, who are here either because you're naturally an early riser or because this topic is important to you. And I'm going to move ahead with the premise that you are here because this topic is important to you, because it is an important topic. Whether you are in the stages of seeking a life partner, whether you are in the stages of already committed to a life partner, whether you are already married, about to get married, never want to get married, have been married, whatever stage of life you're in, we can't deny the fact that seeking a life partner, having a spouse, or going through that process of difficulty with a spouse can really impact our lives. And it impacts every part of our lives. I remember a few years back, there was a talk that was given by Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook at the time, at Barnard College, which is an all-female college in New York. And it was the commencement speech, the day of graduation. And she spoke to the audience members, the women in the audience, and she said, you may think that the most important decision you make is going to be what graduate school you go to. You may think that the most important decision you're going to make is what career you enter into. You may think the most important decision you're going to make is what job you land after graduation. But I'm here to tell you that the most important decision you're ever going to make is who your life partner is. And when she said this, a lot of the women in the audience got very angry and started booing and hissing, saying, I'm independent, why would you even say that? It's not about the life partner. And so she wound up writing a book a few years later called Lean In. And in that book, she talks about the impact of the life partner and how for her, even in her career trajectory, having a life partner who supported her, who was able to truly embody the characteristics of partnership, how that impacted her life. And we know that a few years after that book came out, her spouse actually passed away while they were on vacation. He was 45 years old. He was also a COO, I think, of a large company as well. And he passed away 45 years old while he was on a treadmill exercising while they were on vacation. And so she wrote a follow-up to that book about what life is like without a life partner, what life is like when the person that you thought would be by your side is no longer there. And subhanAllah, I think what this tells us, and I kind of like to start with capturing that essence, that true life experience of someone, it tells us that, again, who we have by our side in life's ups and downs can definitely impact us. But a really interesting element in terms of marriage talks, and particularly at conferences, at MSAs, and in colleges, is that very often the title of the talk will be similar to this one. As soon as I got my speaking list, of what topics I have, my eye always goes to the marriage one first, because that tends to be one of my favorites. And immediately I saw the title, which is very often the title used in marriage talks, which is Happily Ever After. And I find that interesting because, subhanAllah, we often think about finding that life partner, being with a spouse, as our happily ever after. For those of us who maybe grew up watching Disney when it was Cinderella and it was Snow White, and the idea of the white horse and the Prince Charming coming and saving the day. And we know, of course, there's been quite a transition, whether it's with Elsa or Merida in Brave, and the shifting movement of what that looks like. But in reality, when we talk about finding a life partner, when we talk about marriage, using the idea of happily ever after sets us up for great disappointment. Because happiness is a fleeting emotion. Happiness is not a state in which we reside in perpetually in this dunya. Happiness is something that we will experience in moments, in different situations, but it is not something that will be our ever after here in dunya. Insha'Allah, it will be our ever after in Jannah. And I always think that rather than calling the marriage talk happily ever after, I wish we would call it contentedly ever after, finding contentment through marriage. When we look to the Quran, we see the term for marriage, sa'ada. That's the equivalent, essentially, of what happiness is. So not the term for marriage, I apologize, the term for happiness, sa'ada. We only see it mentioned in the Quran twice. Once as a noun and once as an adverb. And both times it speaks of the sa'ada that we will experience in Jannah. But when we look to the word rida, we see it mentioned over 135 times in the Quran and in 85 different ahadith. Rida is contentment. Rida is feeling a sense of well-being, a sense of alhamdulillah for what we have in our life. A sense of recognition that no person is perfect and we ourselves are imperfect, and that if we were to consistently chase a fleeting emotion, we will be disappointed. And so rather than chasing after this idea of happy, when we are seeking a spouse, when we are going through that process of marriage, we want to instead find that element of contentment. Now, contentment doesn't mean that we remain in an oppressive situation, that we remain in an abusive situation, that we remain in a situation in which we may be incompatible with someone because we have to be content. No. Contentment resides in that space of tawakkul, where we trust Allah, but we also take action to improve our situations, where we seek knowledge and we apply that knowledge in our lives. And so feeling content does not mean living a life that is dissatisfied, living in a situation or a marital union in which we are consistently struggling emotionally, physically, mentally. That is not contentment. Contentment is recognizing our flaws and our fallacies. Contentment is recognizing that we will not be finding a completion of ourselves in marriage, but that we will find a space of complementarity, a space in which we are able to reside with a spouse who, in that relationship, each of us strives to become the best version of ourselves. And this is why when we talk about marriage being the completion of our deen, it is not because we simply marry someone and say, Alhamdulillah, I'm now complete, or my deen is now complete. It is because in that marriage relationship, we will become the best versions of ourselves if we consistently strive to love the person for the sake of Allah, we will be the most patient. We will be the most of al-qadhimin al-ghayth, the ones who suppress their anger. We will be the most selfless in our interactions. We will be the most caring. We will be the most compassionate. And in so doing, we complete our deen. Because in so doing, we get nearer and nearer to Allah through our love for Allah. Now, as we start this journey, or maybe we're already in this journey of marriage, as we look for that level of contentment, that connection with a spouse in which we truly experience rida, thanking Allah for that which He has bestowed upon us while recognizing that there is no perfection in this dunya. But as we start this process, we also want to know not just what to look for, but what to look out for. And we can't do that unless we recognize and understand what is causing the breakdowns in relationships today. What is causing the staggering number of divorce that was mentioned at the start of this talk. So what we are seeing primarily in terms of the breakdowns of marriages is that there are 5 areas in which couples tend to struggle. And it's in those 5 areas that we tend to see marriages breaking apart. The first area, and one of the most predominant areas of difficulty, is marital abuse. And oftentimes when I mention abuse, people think physical. They think black eyes, they think being punched. But abuse takes many forms. And within our Muslim communities and within many marriages that break apart, we see issues of financial abuse, issues of emotional abuse, issues of psychological abuse like gaslighting. We see issues of verbal abuse, constant criticism. We see issues of abuse that comes in many different forms. And being in an abusive relationship is not of our deen. Remaining in a situation in which you as a spouse feels unsafe, feels demeaned, feels demoralized, is constantly put down, that is not of our deen. That is not where you become the best version of yourself, because the one you are with is not the best version of himself or herself. And so this is one of the first areas of concern. And we can see in those early days of getting to know someone, we can see personalities, we can see the way that people react and interact. You know, many of you may be familiar with the 100 questions to ask before marriage, which I believe came out of the Adams Center in Virginia. Imam Majid and Sister Salma Abu Gdiri had written it. And it's a great list of questions. But in that list of questions, I've never seen someone answer, for example, the question that says, what do you do when you're angry? I've never heard in a premarital session someone say, well, I throw chairs and I punch walls. No, most of the time the answer to that question is, well, you know, if I'm angry, I take deep breaths. I go and make wudu. You know, if I'm standing, I sit. If I'm sitting, I lie down. Excellent answers. But really, do we know how someone reacts and how they interact by asking that question? Or are we more likely to know the answers to questions in how someone answers rather than what they answer with? You know, I often share my own marriage story. You know, for my husband, we were in college together. We met in our freshman year Arabic class. And you know, when I was 17 at that time, and I remember the first day of Arabic class, my husband waited for me after class and he said, I'm gonna marry you. And I said, over my dead body, like never. And 4 years, you know, time would go on. I would leave my lecture hall, and if it was raining, I'd find him standing outside with an umbrella. You know, I'd find him feeding my meter so I wouldn't get a ticket. And every time I'd be like, I'm not marrying you, I'm not marrying you, I am definitely not marrying you. This was about 30 years ago, guys, okay? So we've been married, almost 26 and a half years now. So over those years in college, I thought I knew this guy. I saw him from a distance. He had, you know, big beard, vice president of the MSA. It was called ISRO at that time, you know. And I just kept thinking, definitely, this is not the type of person I want to marry. And it wasn't until my senior year, it was my 21st birthday, and everybody forgot my birthday. And I remember back then, this was the 90s, so email was very difficult to connect with. But somehow he found a way in the satellite room that was on our campus to send me an email that I received when I went to the computer room. And in the email he said, I know you can't stand me. I'm still gonna marry you, and happy birthday. Right? And I remember at that point, I just thought, you know what, like this guy has been around for so long, that's fine, let him come, visit my family. And so I told him, you can come visit my family. And so when he came, I had prepared a list of about 125 questions, stapled together, and I figured I was really going to grill him. And I remember I asked him the first question, and he said something funny, and I asked him another question, and he said something funny, and then I asked him another question, and I was like, this guy is funny, right? And as we continued talking, I realized, I could have asked him 100, 200, 300 more questions, and he still would have answered, and he would have answered patiently. And there were moments in that conversation that I began to realize that what my husband, and alhamdulillah, we always tell our kids, alhamdulillah, he was persistent and he knew he was gonna marry me before I knew. But it was in that conversation, in being able to listen to how he responded, not what he was responded. And my questions were questions like, if you had a time machine, what time period would you travel to? If you were a cartoon character, what cartoon character would you be? If there was an actor that was going to play you in a movie, what actor would it be? And to me, it was important to see, would he say, astaghfirullah, I don't watch movies, or would he say, cartoons, are you kidding me? I haven't watched cartoons since I was a kid. Or how he would respond. And so oftentimes we think that we will know someone simply from seeing them, from a distance. But really, to understand how someone interacts, we want to be able to know ourselves and to know what's important to us, to know where our lines are and what we will not be able to compromise on and what we can compromise on. And this takes a lot of work in terms of getting to know who we are. We know, for example, that there is a study that was done that showed that people who lived together or dated intensely for 1 or more years prior to marriage had a 70% greater likelihood of divorce than people who never dated before marriage. So to me, and this is a general study that was done not within the Muslim community, it's not about striving so hard to know someone else. It is about knowing yourself and knowing what you're seeking. So to go back to our areas of demise in marriage, so the first one we said is abuse. The second area of demise in marriage is infidelity. And again, when we talk about infidelity, it's not always physical. It's not always the typical affair that we think of, but infidelity can occur when there is a betrayal of trust in the marital relationship, when that which is meant to remain within the sanctity of the couple is instead given elsewhere. And today, with the ease of communication, of texting, of Snapchat, of Twitter, of Facebook, of all these different avenues of communicating and connecting, we see less communication and connection between spouses and more, unfortunately, communication and connection between those that are outside. And so the one who commits emotional cheating may be engaging in a relationship that is emotionally and psychologically based on connecting with someone else rather than connecting with their spouse. And as we see the process of marriage changing, as we begin to see a lot more action in Muz or Minder or Salams or many of these apps, I think there's a Beyond Chai and so many other apps that are out there, we tend to lower our levels of being aware, essentially, in terms of our interactions prior to marriage, because we are seeking. And when we lower those elements of gender boundaries that Allah Azza wa Jal has granted in place for our own safety and protection, when we do that prior to marriage, it can sometimes be very difficult after marriage to maintain that sanctity of being with that spouse. And so I know many of you are familiar with the term that's often used, that's A, B, C, D, E, and the letter after E, and then the word boy afterwards. I'm constantly hearing females calling other males that name. I hear males calling girls that name as well. The idea of players, people engaging in multiple relationships prior to marriage to see what's out there. We don't suddenly get married and we snap our fingers and then we're able to only have eyes for our spouse. Protect your eyes prior to marriage. Protect your hearts prior to marriage. Protect your tongues prior to marriage. Because within the marriage paradigm, that protection will allow you to only have eyes for your spouse, to only have that heart for your spouse, to only have that connection of emotional and really that love that we talk about in the form of mawadda wa rahmah. will exist for your spouse and in that marriage paradigm. The emotional and empathetic elements of marriage are so critical, particularly in that stage of maintaining the sanctity of the marriage as well. So when we look to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of my favorite narrations of the emotional intelligence of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes from Aisha radiallahu anha, who narrates and says she was on her menses. And as she sat with the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they had a vessel between them that had water. And they were eating their meal, and she said she took the vessel and took a sip of it, and then placed it back on the table. And then the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam picked up the vessel and turned it to the exact spot that the lips of Aisha radiallahu anha had touched, and he drank from that vessel, from that same spot. And in providing this narration, we recognize that Aisha radiallahu anha is telling us that she felt a little out of sorts that day. She was on her menses. She felt unclean. And in that moment of emotional connection, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam recognizes how uncomfortable she feels. He recognizes her discomfort. And so without saying a word, he shows her, he tells her, I love you, in the most romantic of ways, for his lips to touch the exact spot that her lips had touched on that vessel of water. And this type of empathetic response, this type of emotional connection between spouses, so often it's missing, because what we see today is this preoccupation with the cell phone, so that you're sitting eating a meal and your spouse maybe can't even make eye contact with you because they're looking at their phone, or they're on their laptop, or they're not engaging with you in a way that feels like you are connected. So often when we have couples experiencing difficulties in our office and they're talking about so many of the problems that they feel they have together, I'll ask them to pull out their phone and to show me the last text message that they sent each other. And I kid you not, 9 times out of 10, the last text message to each other is something like, you forgot to take out the garbage, ... again, or did you pick up the kids? Don't forget milk. The emotional content isn't there. Instead, the communication devolves into the functional. And there is a functionality that exists in the marriage where, okay, we're raising the kids, we're doing the shopping, we're cooking the meals, we're paying the bills, but where is the emotional connection? Where are those moments of sharing that vessel of water like the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Where are those moments of empathy where you connect with your spouse and you feel that sanctity within the marital relationship? If we are missing it in our homes, oftentimes we will look for it elsewhere, whether it's finding some type of emotional fulfillment in our jobs, in our PlayStations, in our games, on our phones, in our social media, with someone else. And this is the danger of not maintaining that emotional element within the marital relationship. Now, the third area of demise in which we see difficulty in marriages is cultural differences. And the cultural differences are not always, you are from Pakistan and I am from Egypt, or you speak this language and I speak that language. Cultural differences are more often linked to differences in worldview. How were you raised? What is important to you? How do you connect with others? When we look to the Quran, we see that marriage verse in Surah Al-Rum that is most often cited, verse 21, where Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us that He has created us as husband and wife, لِتُسْقُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that you will reside in tranquility. How? With mawadda wa rahma, with care and mercy. But if we were to look before that verse in verse 20, we see that Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us that He has created us as different people, بَشَرٌ تَنْتَشِرُونَ, that we have been dispersed in the land. We are different. And then we are reminded that He brings us together, and in this is an ayah, in this is a miracle for those who give thought, that He brings us together and somehow we find tranquility in that marital relationship. And yet the verse that follows that is a verse that reminds us again of our differences. اختلاف ألوانكم وألسنتكم, that He has created us with a difference in our colors and a difference in our tongues. And the difference in our tongues is, again, not that I speak French and you speak Spanish, that I speak Arabic and you speak Urdu. The difference in our tongues relates to how we express ourselves. And very often in our offices, when we have couples who are struggling and having difficulty, we'll have maybe a wife who will say something like, I don't feel like my husband loves me. And the husband will be like, what are you talking about? And she'll say, you never say I love you. You never say you're beautiful. You never tell me sweet words. And the man might respond and say something like, I just vacuumed the whole house for you, woman. What more do you want, right? And we see here that the woman is speaking the language of affirmation, seeking out those positive words. The husband is speaking the language of service. Or maybe he's speaking the language of gifting, or the language of time, or the language of touch. But in each of those 5 different languages, in each of those 5 different tongues, there is a miscommunication that occurs because it feels like the connection isn't there. All right, I know I have a few minutes remaining, and we have 2 more areas that we wanted to talk about. So we said the first area of demise is abuse. The second area of demise is infidelity and a lack of emotional connection within the marital relationship. The third area of demise is differences in cultures, worldviews, in the tongues that are spoken, and the way that people connect with one another. The third area of difference is parents. Parents and in-laws, and we could probably have a whole other lecture just on that topic. But our parents often will cause an essential emotional transference, where if in their marital relationship they did not receive that empathy, that emotional connection that they were seeking, they can often transfer their desire for that empathy and emotional connection towards their children. And when their children grow older and seek out marriage, there comes to be a period of possessiveness in which the parents struggle to be able to transition, to move past and into the recognition that their adult child is now starting their own journey with their own spouse. And that emotional transference can cause grave difficulty. We also often hear parents who will say things, how could you want to marry this person? I will cut you off. You are no longer my daughter. You are no longer my son. And we struggle because we are reminded consistently not to say uff to our parents. But we can be good to our parents. And this is what the Quran commands us, to be good to our parents. We can be good to our parents, and we can also develop healthy boundaries. And this is to the males and the females. Healthy boundaries in which we recognize when we enter into the marital relationship, this nuclear unit becomes the unit in which we must build and which we must connect. And that our parents will always be our parents, but our parents will not be our partners. And sometimes within the partnership, we may begin to parent, or we may allow our parents to involve themselves in this marital relationship. Like I said, we could have a whole other conversation on this topic, but most often when we see parents and in-laws being cited as, a source of difficulty or strain, it is not the parents or the in-laws, but it is the way the spouses respond to the parents and the in-laws. I have seen couples who live in the same joint family home, for example, with parents or in-laws, and they are able to navigate through that relationship through healthy boundaries. And I have seen couples in which the parents live thousands of miles away in other countries, and they don't have healthy boundaries, and so there is great difficulty that comes into the relationship. So learn how to have those healthy boundaries, talk them through, understand them, know where your spouse is coming from and where you're coming from. Okay, and the last one, as my time is up, the last area, or 5th area of demise that we see is really a catch-all. It's stress. And it is stress that is financially related, stress in an economy that is heading towards a recession that looks like it may cause great difficulty. It is stress that may come from having children, from having different perspectives on tarbiyah and how to raise children. It is stress that comes from mental health, and that is a whole other topic as well. We are seeing unprecedented numbers of clinical anxiety, diagnosable depression, difficulties in terms of mental health that are showing up within the marriage paradigm as well. And living with a partner, with a spouse who may struggle with their mental health can be a great stressor. It can be a great cause of stress. And it's something that you want to be upfront about, you want to talk about. It doesn't mean that if you struggle with your mental health, you're never going to find a spouse or a life partner. No, it means together, as spouses, recognizing that mental health and mental difficulty and mental struggles is a bala, a tragedy, a difficulty, a test from Allah, but it is no different than a test of physical pain, a test or hardship, a disease that someone acquires. That it doesn't mean the end of a relationship, it means that together strategically you work through the difficulty as partners. And again, that topic of stress, maybe that's what we could have in next year's conference, inshallah, stress in marriage, stress in relationships, because that in itself has a lot. So we only scratched the surface, and there is a lot more that we can talk about. But I hope that in the Q&A, maybe we can get a little bit deeper into some of these questions. If you have further questions, we do have a Cornerstone booth. Cornerstone is the organization that I run that focuses on premarital facilitation, premarital education, we've got compatibility courses, we've got all sorts of different counseling that we offer, as well as, of course, youth counseling, refugee counseling, and lots of other things. We do have a booth in the bazaar, C25. You can visit us there. Dr. Samira from FYI asked me to also mention a course that FYI, Family Youth Institute, has, which is called Prepare to Pair, which also provides premarital information. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, so how do you balance seeking marriage with seeking a career? Is that the question? Okay. So I love that question, and I think a lot of times we've been conditioned to believe it's either or. Either, and particularly I'm speaking from the perspective of females in particular, but either you get married or you have a career. Either you raise children and take on the role of motherhood, or you have a career and you work outside of the home. And it's not an either or. It's not an either or. This is not what our deen teaches us. Again, when we look to Khadija radiallahu anha, we see that she was a successful businesswoman essentially. And she was married to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And we know it was she who provided that support to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam emotionally, physically, mentally, but also very often financially through the journey of difficulty that they faced in Mecca. So I don't think we should have this dichotomy in which it's either or. Instead, it's recognizing that there are times in our marriage life cycle in which maybe we can spend more time focusing on career. Maybe we can spend more time focusing on family. And this is where the life partner is so important. I'll tell you, for me, one of the questions on my list that I had for my husband did have to do with career, and I thought I had a linear trajectory, this is when I'm going to finish my master's, this is when I'm going to finish my PhD, this is what I'm going to do afterwards. And we know that Allah is the best of all planners. For my husband and I, despite having, this plan, Allah, of course, had different plans for us. And, in the beginning of our marriage, despite saying, okay, we're going to have baby number 1 at this time, baby number 2 at this time, Allah decreed that we had difficulty conceiving. And when we did conceive, we experienced several miscarriages. And when we did carry to term, our first daughter was stillborn. And we went through great difficulty in starting our family. And through that time, I kept thinking, okay, but my career, and I have to pause it and I have to wait. And subhanAllah, it took me 21 years to finish my PhD. And I know it was my husband, every step of the way, every time I'd be like, I can't do this anymore. You know what, I'm going to focus on our kids. And alhamdulillah, we were blessed with 3 children. My oldest, who's almost 23 now, and the youngest is almost 16. But, every step of the way, it was having my husband there, reminding me that we're in this together, that we're going to figure it out. And there were times, when my husband was a financial analyst, so he used to work in New York. And in 2008, right when one of my first books was coming out, he came home one day and he said, I quit my job. And I was like, wait, what? And I was like, what are you gonna do? And he's like, I'm gonna open a restaurant. And I was like, dude, you cook cereal. I don't understand, how are you gonna do this? And he was like, listen, we need some balance in our life. I wanna be there more often for the kids. You're just starting, in terms of the books coming out and things like that. And subhanAllah, we shifted gears a little bit. At that point, I was primarily at home with the kids. They were very young at that time. And my husband was the one that was outside of the home. And at that time, we shifted gears. And that's when I began to focus more on my career. He started the restaurant, alhamdulillah, right next to our home. And that's something, and he turned out to know how to cook, so that was good. But, this is something that we had to adjust together. So I think the first area of change in mindset is do not think it's either or. It is not either career or marriage. It is finding a life partner who together you will support one another as your careers evolve, okay? Following the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam means, yes, marry that right person who inshallah together you're going to build that future together. The next part of the question was about parents. How do you get your parents on board? So I'm not sure what the personal situation is exactly. We know parents have reservations for all sorts of reasons. I think the first step is understanding your parents' reservations. If they're telling you, well, you can't get married until you finish medical school, or until you're cemented in your career so that you have financial backing to fall upon. Again, we know that rizq comes from Allah. And maybe having that conversation with your parents, and I'm sure your parents know, but gently reminding them that if a rizq is written for us, it can be as far away as the furthest mountain and it will come to us. And if it is not written for us, it can be between our lips and we will not receive it. So guiding your parents maybe with gentle reminders, having loved ones, maybe aunts, uncles, cousins, community members talk to them, bringing them to our booth, C25 in the bazaar, and have me talk to them. Sometimes parents just need to see things from a different perspective, but I'm not a fan of either or at all.
So the next question relates to interracial marriages. So this question is kind of asking, what are some challenges that can arise in an interracial relationship? How can they be prevented or overcome?
All right, Jazakallah khair. Another very good question. So we know that interracial is different, of course, than intercultural. Interracial is when the race itself differs, as opposed to intercultural when we're talking about the culture itself differing. All of us essentially are in intercultural marriages because our cultures are based, again, on our upbringing. It's based on our worldview. It's based on things that we've developed within our families and our homes, and each of us has a different culture in our homes. Not all of us are in interracial marriages. Interracial marriages are often very heavily laden with stereotypes and prejudices that can come into the relationship, particularly whether it's from parents, from community, but just from different perspectives. And a lot of times when it comes to interracial marriages, it's about really doing the legwork and having those conversations beforehand, recognizing that race is a factor. There's a great book that I would recommend everybody reads. It's called Race Matters by Cornel West. And in that book, Race Matters, he talks about the nihilistic threat, how within races that have been particularly marginalized, that have been, demeaned over history, over time, that within those races there may exist a nihilistic threat in which the self itself struggles because of self-concept, self-image, and that self-image and self-concept is essentially a compilation of what exists outside of that individual and how their race is viewed. So entering into an interracial marriage, yes, it will come with some extra legwork maybe, but I believe that there is legwork that needs to be done in any marriage. So I would not shy away from it. I would never say, this is not of our deen to turn someone away because of their race. We know the last khutbah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a reminder that there is no superiority from an Arab over a non-Arab and vice versa. So there is no difference in terms of the superiority or how we view race. But we do need to let go of our stereotypes, of our prejudices, and enter into marriages looking at the person for who they are, not what race they belong to.
The next question says, how do you find the strength to keep seeking a spouse after a failed engagement or relationship?
Yeah, great question. So when we experience difficulty in a relationship, whether it's an engagement that didn't work out, whether it's a marriage, a divorce, something that occurred that has caused great pain, it can be difficult to trust again. And that's one of the biggest things that I most often hear, that I can't trust anyone. How do I know it's not going to happen again? And again, this is where our tawakkul comes into play, trusting Allah. Trusting that even if we did go through a very difficult or harrowing experience, that Allah Azza wa Jal knows us better than we know ourselves, that Allah tests us in ways, not always ways that we want, but they're ways that we need. And that whatever test we've been through is a test that inshallah will draw us nearer to Allah. So the first step would be working on yourself, working on, and I don't want to say working on healing, because healing is a journey. Healing is something that we are consistently working on day in and day out, regardless of what difficult experiences we may have been through. So
work on yourself, seek out therapy, go to counseling, make sure that you are working through whatever baggage you may have carried with you from a relationship that ended before, because we don't ever come out unscathed. We usually will have remnants of difficulty in a relationship that did not pan out, that maybe we had high hopes for, that maybe it fell apart, or after a divorce. So work on clearing out as many of the cobwebs as you can. Enter into a new relationship without projecting the difficulties of the past. It's a different person, different relationship, different dynamics. But it's hard to do that alone, and that's why I would definitely say seek out counseling in terms of recovering from that difficulty before entering into another relationship.